back to my previous point. This goes back to my previous point about refuge providers who are familiar with the clients they work with and really need to be a part of the decision making. The third lesson, and probably the final lesson that I'd say would be worth noting, is this point about the different sections of the department overseeing the different types of quality service being done versus the build. And that makes it really, really difficult. And I'll give you one example of that is that in the service delivery side, we were obviously negotiating 24/7 services at the refuge, but in the building side, there was no sleepover room initially included in the core and cluster model, you know, so I guess it depends on what the model is, but that's why it's really important to have the services right at the heart of what's happening. So refuges are also expected to provide services to children and young people as clients in their own right. But as I mentioned, some refuges had playgrounds and basketball courts removed due to budget constraints, which meant refuges had not all refuges always had child-friendly spaces to work with until, you know, there was some intervention there. So just giving you some ideas about the consistency issues as well that are really important. So really, I think that's really the big lessons. And I know that you've got Matt's going to speak as well, but I can come back and maybe sum up in some of the Q&As about some of the issues there. So I think that, you know, the project development for us comprise really three main components: the site selection, the design and construction, and the establishment and the operations. And it's really important, we found, that services are part of all three aspects of design, because you know yourselves that site selection is really critical, because we want to make sure the sites are near amenities, public transport, etc. The design and construction, obviously I mentioned around a whole range of issues around that. And one thing I was going to say too, and you might find this now in New South Wales as you embark on your development too, COVID has obviously delayed constructions due to the provision of supplies and materials. So making sure realistic timeframes for the implementation of these and what can happen in the you know, what sort of supports there are in the meantime, you know, between construction. So right, maybe I'll end there, Delia, if that's helpful, and we can come back to some of the conclusive points later.
Brilliant, thanks Tania, that's great. I think there's some three really essential learnings there, and particularly just where you mentioned around the timeframes between now and when the refuges will be operational. I think it's going to be really important for everyone to consider in terms of safety, and then exit pathways beyond refuge. These are some of the things that we're making sure are considered in our paper. Thank you so much. I'll now welcome Matt Barden. And again, thank you, Matt, for joining us today. Away you go. Thank you. Oh, and Matt, I think you're on mute.
Hi, Delia. Sorry, I'm having the worst technical issues today. I don't know why. I've dropped out twice since the meeting.
We'll try and hang in there with you. Thank you so much for coming.
Look, first of all, I'll also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I live and work on, as the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and extend my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal colleagues with us today. And can I say I could listen to Tania for the entire hour, because that's really the phase that we're in the department. Is I think the metaphor that one of my colleagues has used is that we're the dog that's caught the car. That, you know, you sort of advocate for these things and then you actually get it, and then you've got to figure out how to deliver it. So I think Delia sort of mentioned we're trying to go really fast, but also take a minute to get things right now, rather than, you know, just listening to some of the lessons from Tania, you know, in 2 or 3 years be trying to fix things that we could have I think I'm back.
We just lost you. And feel free, Matt, if it's easier to turn your camera off and give that a go as well, if that helps. We're pretty much with you though, with everything you've said so far. It's just breaking up a tiny bit.
That might help. Okay, we'll try it without the camera and hopefully that works. Sorry about this, everyone. I've had no technical issues until this meeting started. And so, look, I'll just give a quick overview of what the announcement actually was, because there are a few different bits to it, and there are actually two different announcements that happened in quick succession. So just to be clear, what we're talking about. So there was an announcement on the 16th of October, which was about fast tracking about 1,400 new homes. That was a $183 million announcement. That's not the core and cluster one that we're talking about, but it does have some things that sound a little bit like it. So just quickly.
This is such a shame. We've just lost you again, Matt.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. We've got you back again. Let's go for it. So you were going to tell us a bit more of the detail of the second announcement.
Yeah, let's get the first announcement because who knows when I'm going to break out again. Look, the main thing I was just going to say is that there was sort of 50 million announced for the Community Housing Innovation Fund to bring forward projects from the first round of that as part of that first announcement. And there's also Community Housing Innovation Fund money in the new announcement. And I just wanted to make it clear there's 50 million announced first and then 52.5 million.
We've lost Matt again, but I do know that that 52.5 million was for 200 social houses, which is new in the domestic and family violence for domestic and for victim survivors. And hoping you're back with us, Matt.
I am.
Great.
I'm wondering if there's a way I can dial in or something, which might be less annoying for people.
I'm not too sure. I don't know if we've got anyone who can maybe message me and let me know. If you can call in, or is there any way you could possibly, now your camera's off, move somewhere where the signal might be better?
I am basically sitting on top of my router.
Okay.
Matt, I'm just
sorry,
gonna, Matt, I'll just email you the phone link. Won't be a sec.
Thank you. Apologies, everyone.
No problem at all. And what I might do as well, everyone, is quickly just pop those announcements, those media releases in the chat box so you can see them. But there were, like, as Matt mentioned, announcements after announcements. But I mean, the main one we're talking about today is the 484 million. And that was where we understand there's going to be 75 new refuges. We understand there's going to be 200 new social houses. We also know there's going to be some refurbishments to existing refuges, about 8 existing, and I've just seen your comment, Petra, I'll come on to that, but we know that 8 refuges are going to be refurbished, but again, there's still, I think, time that Matt wants to hear from you all about that too. And there's also a small pilot, which is about 5 million for children at risk of homelessness, and there's going to be a bit of work looking at, in a regional part of New South Wales and a metro part of New South Wales, a programme for children that are at risk of homelessness, and the aim is to support 800 of them per year with a programme coordinator and some kind of therapeutic care work and health work with those children. We don't know what that looks like yet, but we do know that 484 has been split into those 4 areas I just spoke to. And Petra's just said, any further information regarding existing services being able to redevelop with this new money, or is it shovel-ready new projects? I guess that's going to be an interesting question for Matt, Petra, but we've certainly fed into DCJ around existing services, and we know that they're currently, again, as part of this kind of go fast but slow down, let's look at what land we've got, let's look at where services exist. So I do think this part today is very initial, everyone, and really important that Matt is here hearing what people have got to say and hearing so far what Matt and his team have been up to. Matt, have you managed to call in?
I haven't called in, but I am still here. I haven't got those details just yet. Yeah, look, in terms of the 484.3 million announcement, yeah, there's 426.6 million is the core and cluster, which includes around 75-ish new core and cluster model refuges, including funding for the service. So this isn't, you know, within existing resources, there's service funding for the new services. There's also, as Delia said, the funding for Land and Housing Corporation to redevelop around 8 existing refuges in that model. So I've had some conversations with LAC about how they're going to identify those services. They have a process that they're setting up now to sort of look through which ones might be suitable. This is similar to the process that we've already been going through with the trial sites. So you might be aware there was about 6 million committed for 4 redevelopments as core and cluster. So the one that's been delivered in with linking communities and the one that's been delivered in orange with Housing Plus. And there are 2 more regional ones in progress, and the AG has also committed to a 5th one. So we already have a process that we're working with LAC on to identify suitable sites for those, but it's about 8. Those are full sort of redevelopment projects. But I don't have a lot of detail on exactly how that process is going to work. But definitely open to sort of input on how people would like that process to work. There's also some money within that 426.6 million for fire safety and accessibility upgrades, which would be just bringing forward things that would happen through the normal course of events, but specifically for women's refuges. So on the 426.6 and the new refuges, yeah, what I was saying before is where we're at is between now and about March next year, we're probably not going to be going out for a lot of sort of consultation or input or anything like that. Right now, well, this is the sort of consultation we're trying to do. We're trying to gather people's thoughts about how we should approach it. What I'm trying to say is we're not going to initiate a procurement process next week or anything like that. We're conscious that COVID is still a big priority and a big pressure for services, and also that people sort of just want to get through the end of the year and people need to take leave and things like that. We're not trying to rush this through now, but there is planning internally that we need to be doing, and we're very grateful to DV New South Wales in particular for sort of, you know, being able to bring forward some of that feedback through processes like this, and the feedback that Delia mentioned before that they're working on. We'll also be talking to our agency counterparts in Victoria about their experience, and we've obviously got some lessons ourselves from the trial sites that we've been working on. From, yeah, sort of March, April-ish, we would expect to be doing a bit more open consultation on how we might go about it. Everything at this point, if I was to say, you know, what is that going to look like, would be a little bit speculative. There's a really strong intention that it be a locally led approach through the districts and local services as the people who have the best sort of understanding of what's needed in the community. So if there was one thing that's probably worth thinking about now, it's, you know, what is the need in the local community? Who are the sort of players who might end up involved in something like this? What sort of partnerships might need to be developed or strengthened? But yeah, this is really just to say there's no urgency to, you know, I need a site here, or what about redeveloping my property. This is a project that's funded over 4 financial years from July next year.
We've got you, Matt, back again, I think, which is great. We didn't lose you for too long.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
What I was saying is an important point. This is a program of work that's funded over 4 financial years from July next year. So I imagine there will be, you know, potentially multiple waves of this and opportunities to learn from our own processes. Yeah, it is genuinely too early to say exactly what it's going to look like. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk too long, because probably the most value for everyone in this process is to sort of share what what you want to see happen or what your concerns are.
Great, thanks, Matt. And I don't know if you mentioned this, but not everybody knows this, but the Refuges will be operational by 23-24. And I think it's about being realistic now about that interim piece until then, knowing that we've got huge issues in regional New South Wales. We had a community of practice session yesterday, and there was just some really scary stories about, which again, I'll talk to you about on Thursday with the DCJ team, just around the homelessness issues with Christmas coming and everything else. But yeah, I welcome that open dialogue with you. I thank you so much for getting through the technical issues, and I will now open to Renata to get facilitating. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and really appreciate Tania and Matt, what you brought to the conversation. Would love to open it up to members. If you want to pop your camera on, you can and put your hand up, ask a question, or just pop it in the chat box. We've got a question already from Kiralee about the possibility of knocking down and rebuilding existing refuges. Matt, did you have any thoughts on that?
I guess, sorry, Matt, before you answer, I'll clarify that we already have, well, one of the pilots of successful core and cluster units. Now, I guess the issue that we had with them, they had to be built on land and housing court land, absolutely get that. But we have the refuge site, which is a long-term lease, leased to us by our council, with a property that is over 50 years old sitting on it, and a very, very substantial block of land. And I would hope in this round of funding, there would be some flexibility in not just providing buildings on land and housing court land, that would be considered, because it's an ideal block of land, and we could increase our core and cluster size by 3-fold if we were able to do that. And it's leased to us from the council while ever it's a women's refuge. So I would hope, Matt, that there would be consideration for something like that, given that in rural areas, the lack of land and housing court land is a dire issue.
Thanks, Kiralee. And it's good to see you, by the way. I haven't seen you in a little while. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I was a bit flustered with the technology issue, so I didn't talk about the land aspect of this, which is there's an intention to use some LAC land, potentially some other government land, but we'll also be looking at what can council and community housing providers bring as well. So it's not exactly the same as your experience with the redevelopment. It is, you know, what are the opportunities? Because frankly, we don't have enough land to deliver all of this in this time frame anyway. So we're definitely committed to a mixed sort of approach.
Thank you, Matt. That's really positive to hear. And I think it would be great to get as much support to ensure that the services that we end up building are placed in really accessible spaces, because we know that that is so significant for the people who are using them, that they have access to trains and buses and shops and all the things they need to be safe. Did anyone else have questions for Tania or Matt? I have a list of about 20 questions for both of them, but I'll let members jump in first. We've got Sue Pollock with a question about the locations, about how they'll be determined. So I think I heard from Matt, you saying that they are not yet determined. And we heard in the initial release from the Attorney General that there will be a focus on regional rural. And I heard you saying, Matt, that there's also going to be, we'll be looking at need. Do you have any initial thoughts on how you'll determine that need? I know it's a very complex question and I'm sure you're battling with it now.
Yeah, so the work that we need to do over the next few months, as I was saying, sort of towards March next year, is defining how we're going to approach things like priority locations and so forth. As you say, there's definitely a commitment when the announcement was made that there would be a focus on rural and regional areas, which there definitely will be. But you know, not to neglect our metro areas, which also have significant need. And so I think there is enough data around this space to get some pretty good indications. And then, as I said, the focus we intend is really going to be on a locally led approach anyway. So, you know, taking it down a step from our office to sort of the district level even, that's going to add a whole level of understanding of where you'd prioritise these locations.
Fantastic, thank you so much. While I'm waiting for a chat, I'm going to squeeze in one of my questions. Tania, it was great to hear that you're speaking about minimum standards, and I'm aware that in New South Wales, we don't have those, but we work with the DV New South Wales good practice guidelines, and we have been advocating for years for government to take on the good practice guidelines. I was wondering if you could just speak a little to how useful those minimum standards are in the Victorian context.
Sure, thanks, Renata. We found that they were super important because they also supported the level and quality of service delivery expected. So it wasn't just from the buildings, but it was just about what could take part in those buildings and what could take place in those buildings. And we're still finalising the minimum standards. We had to do some of this retrospectively, as I mentioned, because it wasn't taken into account. But Family Safety Victoria has really come on board and is really working hard with the other part of we've had another departmental name change, but is now called Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. So with DFFH, so they've been working because they're part of that department to try and get those minimum standards sort of agreed. But really, if I cannot emphasize enough, and this is to you as well, Matt, to really work really closely with the services in the first instance to really identify the minimum standards that are required around not for the construction, but the construction is closely linked to the service delivery there. So if you can really agree some of those standards earlier on, working really closely with the sector in a true partnership arrangement, I think that you will find that a lot of issues that might emerge later on won't, because I mean, you can never take into account everything that's going to happen, like let's be realistic, but as much as you've got a comprehensive governance group that where you've got the relevant expertise, you're likely to cover off on a lot of the issues that might end up becoming problem later on. And Matt, it might be worthwhile, and I can do this too, I can reach out to FSME and see where we're at with some of those things, and I'd be happy to come back to you in DV New South Wales.
Thanks, Tania, that's very generous of you. We'll be continuing to meet with DCJ and we can facilitate that conversation. Thank you. There's a couple of questions for you, Matt. Is there any information regarding existing services being able to redevelop with this money? And similar question from Annabelle, is there consideration for refurb of non-LAC properties?
Yeah, and I noticed there was also a question about whether LAC will be responsible for the builds. So the commitment that was made in the announcement is for new services primarily. So it was around 75 new core and cluster model services. Obviously, what we want is, you know, the best service system possible. So I think there's going to be more of that discussion at the local level about, you know, is a new site better than redeveloping an existing site? To be clear on the LAC aspect of it, some of the builds will be LAC, I imagine, or LAC in partnership with the community housing provider. But as I said before, the model that we're going for is really about what's the best land, what's the best partnership and value that we can get in each project. It's not about looking at the LAC-owned land only. So yes, if there are other opportunities, that's, you know, what we're looking for. And yes, private would be included potentially, or definitely, as long as it's in partnership with CHP and a provider.
Thank you so much, Matt. And well done for answering three questions in one. Love that. Anyone else got questions for Tania or for Matt? I have another question for you, Tania. In terms of the partnerships that were developed, it's great to hear how important the specialisation of services is and was in those developments. I was wondering how exactly the collaborations worked. Was it in each local district that you had kind of a group, or was there one sort of oversight group that had specialists and DV VIC working on it?
There were, the project control groups were locally based, so the refuge providers were on that. What we did at the peak was we brought the refuge providers together to try and see what the common themes were in terms of the establishment, so that we could advocate as a peak to the department for some of those more systemic issues that were arising in the builds. So one of the important things that I was going to share, one of the important lessons for us, was that opportunity for refuge providers to come together and share their own learnings and to be able to identify what some of those systemic issues were that were emerging, so that you can sort of start getting a picture for what is common across the system and what needs to be. I mean, there's always local requirements, you know, that you've got to allow for some local context, but yeah, that worked really well for us as a peak, bringing those refuge providers to. And I think the department really appreciated it as well in terms of identifying those systemic issues. And as much as the department ever appreciates, of course, advocacy by the sector.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Renata, I have a question. It's Charlotte from Coffs Harbour. We were successful in one of those refurbishment grants, but of course, we've distributed the quotes and the work that we did. We can't get any builder to provide us with a quote. They're also saying they're going to have difficulty getting the materials. We're an old house. And I'm wondering, should we return that money now and hope that we would be more successful with core and cluster model? Or is that a risk?
Did you want me to have a go at that one, Renata?
Yes, please, Matt.
Okay. I would probably take that chat offline, just because I'd need to understand exactly what the funding arrangement currently was. But definitely the broader issue that you're referring to around material costs and supply at the moment, everyone's come out of lockdown and they have grand plans, and it's not a good time to try and bid right now, which is sort of the advantage of going a little bit slow on some of these projects too. Like, these aren't kicking in until July next year, so we do have a little sort of a bit of a delay on those issues, and the construction is over 4 years. But Charlotte, yeah, let's have a chat about your existing issue, because I wouldn't want to give you bad advice here.
Thank you.
And I think that's a worthy note, Charlotte. We were successful in one of those as well, but it might be worth Matt considering to extend those deadlines for those grants that were given.
Thanks, Kirili. Very happy to look into it.
I just another question, sorry. And
Kirili and then Petra.
yeah, this isn't in relation to the core and cluster, but the Community Housing Innovation Fund that you mentioned, Matt, will that sort of be the same time frame for consultation, or what's that look like?
So there are a pool of existing projects that came through the first round tender. So it was a really oversubscribed process. So there are a couple of projects that might even kick off this financial year potentially, because they were sort of ready to go. There will be a further round of tenders, which will be next year sometime. We can give you a firmer date than that a bit later, but probably just the one round again, because it's been such an oversubscribed process previously. But it won't be the exact same process.
Okay.
It's a much more centrally managed process. Sorry.
And will you sort of look at the thing I was mentioning about the leased land, because we were ineligible during the last round because our land is leased? That be something that you could consider, given we've got 5 acres of land sitting there that would build a lot of houses for homeless people in regional areas? Could that be considered as well?
Look, again, I would just say that let's have a discussion about it, because I don't want to write program guidelines on the fly, but it makes sense.
Thank you. Petra, did you want to ask your question directly?
Yeah, no problem. I was just interested in the pilot programs that were mentioned, I think in the Home Ministers New South Wales around proof of concept, and you mentioned that 2 districts or 2 regions had been dedicated, but didn't give any more information. So I'm assuming majority of our services all work in a child-focused way and work with children as victim survivors in their own right. So I was just wondering if that was sort of already dedicated funding for specific services to pilot that, or if that is again going to be sort of an expression of interest. I think it was 5.1 million, something like that.
It's 5.2.
5.2.
Thanks, Petra. Yeah. And I'm glad that you're in the previous one, because I was slightly more coherent, I think, in terms of technology. So yeah, that's funding for 2 trial sites, one sort of metro, one regional. Those haven't been announced yet, and to be honest, that's not my team leading that one. But what we're trying to do is, some of this information together, maybe on a website or something. So what I can commit to is, like, once this information is available and can be shared, we'll be sharing it via the peaks and via publications.
I think just I think because of how, not that it's anyone's fault, but how vague sort of some of the announcements were, this huge amount of money, and then it was very vague and brought up so many questions. A lot of, and I will just speak for myself, there was a little bit of anxiety, I think, around, has there been conversations had, and is this money already dedicated, and we're getting these announcements? But it does seem like this is going to be, but also it doesn't seem like you're going down a tender submission process, more an invitation, or there's been some grants going out that are you just register for them, you get an invitation to register. Is that something that is more likely to be the process as in terms of submissions or procurement, as you stated earlier? You don't know.
For the 5.2 or for overall?
For all of it. I mean, some of it was like, is that, have they had conversations? Like, is that money already dedicated? Just the way it was sort of, but, you know.
Yeah, it is a little bit confusing, and that's what I was going to try and clarify at the start in terms of the fast tracking announcement that happened first and then this announcement. So in the community housing innovation space, there are some projects that have already been through a tender process, and they can sort of be kicked off with that fast track money. In this space, no, we don't have secret plans for 75 refuges or anything like that. We genuinely don't know where they're going to be or who's going to deliver them. We're genuinely interested in working with you on that. And I might just pick up on something Tania said too about the disconnect. I think it's a really positive sign that this announcement and the project is to be delivered through Communities and Justice, because we don't see it as a capital works program. Like the objective isn't to build 75 refuges, it's to build capacity and sort of get better outcomes with the service system, which is our focus. But what comes with that, we're going to figure the asset things a bit. So in terms of what the procurement approach is, that's one of those things where there'll be a bit more information coming out in the first part of next year. Yeah, what I can commit to is that, yeah, we're very strongly focused on the service and the design being integrated, not on build it and they will come.
Thank you. It's been useful also to hear that there's consideration for ways of establishing procurement that are outside of a competitive tendering framework. And it would be great to hear from members as well about your experiences there. I think if we can create those really strong local networks and local partnerships, then we're going to have better services on the ground. And the last thing we want to see is a repeat of going home, staying home. And we want to make sure that the partnerships and the services that are created and funded are really strong and successful. I reckon we could squeeze in one last question if someone has something burning. Tania, did you want to leave with a parting word, or Matt?
Well, I guess I'll just say, like, it sounds like, you know, you've already got some good established relationships with the department. That's really edifying to hear what you just said, Matt, actually. And I think, yeah, you've got the basis for a really good movement forward. I'm happy to share whatever, you know, we get, what we can. And Matt, I'll put you in contact with a key FSV colleague. It might be useful in your instance, and I can send Delia some of those contacts as well. But yeah, happy to share, and yeah, happy to stay in contact with DV New South Wales too about some of the things we're finding or have found. But yeah, it sounds like it's going to be great.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time, Tania and Matt, and all of the members who've made the time to chat with us today. Hope it's been useful to gain a little bit more clarity into the announcement and where things are at. If people have questions, please buzz them through. And for members like Charlotte who had questions specifically about the previous announcements, please get in touch and we can work on those offline to make sure you get the support you need. In December, we're having a regional forum rather than a sector chat. And I just also wanted to say all the best for 16 days. I know that many of you have got fundraisers, chats, online forums and fundraisers. I hope they all go really well. We look forward to connecting with you over the next couple of weeks, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye.